I can, but I'm not going to be making any time. I'll be lucky to make 2 or 3 miles an hour going back out that way. You're probably one of the only vessels right now that can get to the scene. We're going to try to contact those saltwater vessels and see if they can't possibly come about and come back also. We're trying to get a Coast Guard aircraft launch to come up to the area, but I would say things look pretty bad. Like she may have split apart at the seams like the Morale did a few years back.
On November 10, 1975, the Edmund Fitzgerald failed to reach Whitefish Bay. In the last episode, we imagined what might have happened to the Fitzgerald, but now imagine a different scenario. Imagine you were on a Laker that did survive that storm and reached safe harbor after the most harrowing journey of your life. Then, you were asked to turn around and go right back out into the storm. That was what was asked of the Arthur M. Anderson that night.
They're definitely competitors. But that night, they helped each other out more than they ever would otherwise. And then I think heroically, man, you know how nasty it is. You know you're lucky to get home. You got to go back out before you even lay anchor. Look, hats off to Captain Cooper. Do I do that? Why, I don't know. I'd like to think I would, but I can't guarantee it. Heat of the moment, and a lot of captains did not go out that night, as you know. Some did.
That's John Bacon, author of The Gales of November. In this episode, we pick up the story of the Edmund Fitzgerald on the night of November 10th, as Great Lakes sailors, the Coast Guard, and eventually the world came to the horrified realization that the Fitzgerald was lost with all hands. I'm Jay Gabler of the Duluth News-Tribune, and this is Edmund Fitzgerald, 50 Years Below.
Coast Guard that night, the Fitzgerald was far from being ready to go out and perform a major rescue. I mean, this is November. This is the classic time of the year for shipwrecks on the Great Lakes, and the big wrecks tend to be in November. All shipwrecks tend to be in November, general statement. But what's the Coast Guard got ready to go out and maybe save a life? They've got the Mackinac. Where's she? She's downstate under repair, out of service. They've got Mesquite ready to go. She's down under repair, out of service. So there goes 2 of your big rescue assets, potentially. Took them over time to get the helicopters aloft from Traverse City Air Base, as well as the HU-16 Albatross seaplanes, World War II property, by the way. All devices for a very marginal capability. And even the small boats along the south shore of Lake Superior were not prepared to go out. They wouldn't have survived anyway. The ones that were ready to go and the ones that thought was being given to it, particularly the 36-foot Motorlac boat out of Grand Marais, was immediately turned around once they realized what they were going into. That just was far beyond the situation. And nobody's ever asking a Coast Guardsman to commit suicide with poor equipment like that.
That's Frederick Stonehouse, author of one of the most read books about the Edmund Fitzgerald. As he points out, the Coast Guard asked the Anderson and other ships to go out and look for survivors because that night, the Coast Guard did not have many other options.
As I recall, the initial radio call went out to the Sioux Coast Guard station, and the Cooper reached the watchstander. And the watchstander is that Coast Guard individual that is on duty that night. And he answers the radio, he takes the messages, makes the coffee, does reports as necessary. It is an important job. It is a critical job. Who ends up with it that night? The lowest man on the duty totem pole. The man that knows the least is now in the position where he has the most capability of influencing an action. Now it's getting a rescue started. Didn't know what to do. Didn't know how to do it. Finally calls one of the chiefs in who does. They begin to get the process working, and that now will circle down to Coast Guard Rescue and Coordination Center in Cleveland, where they will now get things moving.
The Coast Guard did have a cutter in a port on Lake Superior that night. Unfortunately, that port was Duluth, way back at the point where the Edmund Fitzgerald began its journey over 24 hours before it went down. John Crowley was a crew member on that cutter, the Woodrush. He had just graduated from the Coast Guard Academy that year, 1975.
Fresh out of the academy, reported aboard. Well, graduation was on the 4th of June. Buddy of mine and myself took 2 weeks and flew over, space available, to Hawaii and just sat on the beach, and then came back for our classmate's wedding in San Antonio, and then we had to report in to our ship. So I picked up my car, my sea box, and came up here to Duluth, came up to Woodrush and saluted at the gangway and got assigned a rack, and then said, hey, you better find another place out in town. And so I went out of town to try to find a place, but all kind of happened, and then my little grandmother that next weekend comes up with my parents to see what I'm doing, what I'm going to be doing. And she goes, he went to college and he's on a ship like this with that little stinking cabin. What's all this about? She just couldn't understand it whatsoever, but it is what it is. And, life, you don't sign up for a life of princess cruises and that kind of song. You sign up for a different song when you enter in. So, it was a matter of immediately kind of getting thrown into the mail. They had the change of command, new Captain Hobaugh, who had been the group commander here in Duluth, was cross-decking coming over and to take over command of the Woodrush. And so we were coming aboard at the same time. And I think one thing led to another, and I made a couple of scenes that he must have thought showed leadership, and we, hit it off pretty well from the very beginning. And therefore, I'm one of the watchstanders by the time November 10th comes along that fall.
On the night of November 10th, Crowley was off duty.
Much of the crew was down at, I think it was the Sandbar, which was a bar on the sandbar off the beach here, as extending out to Park Point right before you get to the lift bridge.
The Sandbar building would later become Grandma's Saloon and Grill.
We were watching Monday Night Football, a large number of the crew, and I remember it was Dallas and Kansas City. I don't remember who won. I probably wasn't there for the end of the game.
The football game, which Kansas City would ultimately win 34-31, was being broadcast on ABC. In Duluth, that meant WDIO, Channel 10. News anchor Dennis Anderson was at the studio.
I was at the television station, of course, preparing the 10 o'clock news, which was going to go on the air late that night because of Monday Night Football. Monday Night Football became a very popular program, so I knew we had a huge audience. I got a phone call from a woman in Superior who asked if I knew anything about a ship sinking in Lake Superior. I asked her when, and she said, I think it's tonight. No, but I'll check it out. I no sooner hung up the phone, I got another phone call from another lady, this one in West Duluth, basically asking the same thing. She had heard on shortwave radio that a ship had gone down in Lake Superior, didn't know what kind or the name of the ship. I put a call into the Coast Guard here in Duluth, and they confirmed a ship is indeed down. It's an ore carrier. I don't have any more information than that. Let me give you the phone number to Sault Ste. Marie, the Coast Guard there. So I called the Sioux, and they gave me all the information I needed. The name of the ship. They didn't know exactly how many people were on board, but they did tell me that the ore carrier Arthur M. Anderson had been following the Edmund Fitzgerald, and they could see the lights of it, and all of a sudden the Fitzgerald disappeared.
Dennis Anderson understood the magnitude of his responsibility.
That's a decision that weighs on a broadcast journalist. Do I dare go on the air with this? How much information that I know do I dare put out? Because I'm going to be informing. I knew I was going to be informing families and other loved ones of this tragedy. But the magnitude of the story, I think, forced me to be a part of that incident that night.
Dennis Anderson would become the first journalist to break the news of the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. The news was so urgent, Anderson and his colleagues knew it could not wait.
We didn't have time to warm up the cameras, otherwise I'd have gone on a camera. But it takes minutes, 10, 15 minutes to warm up the camera, so I had to do it live on audio. So I went into the audio booth, they put a bulletin slide on the air, and I went on the air and said something like, we interrupt this program for a special news bulletin from the Channel 10 newsroom.
For people in Duluth, that Monday night football game would forever be associated with the loss of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Dennis Anderson is now in his 80s and retired from WDIO. He still lives in Duluth.
I've had many, many people in the Northland tell me that they were watching the broadcast that night, and they remember me interrupting the football game for the broadcast, and then later for the 10 o'clock or later news that night. And they well remember that, and they said that we'll never forget how you told the story. And that just, again, proof to me that people all over this region still have the memories of that in their mind. Monday Night Football was fairly new, so I knew we would have a huge audience. I mean, the ratings on Monday Night Football were astonishing. So I knew we were going to have to get this right.
As news spread that the Fitzgerald was believed lost, families of the crew members were desperate for information. Here's John Bacon.
Their tools are limited. Their options are limited. We've got all the people in the Church household in Silver Bay. They're gathering around Mrs. Church's tiny AM radio transistor on the kitchen table. That's your news. Then you get Dennis Anderson, of course, on Channel 10 in Duluth. That cut through the noise, of course. But you have very little. And they don't have each other's phone numbers. There are no cell phones. They're not in each other's phones. You don't know any of this stuff. I'm struck how quickly these families connected to each other. They don't have a mimeograph list, even of the crew. They don't know what's going on. And they managed to find each other, and they became closest family themselves to this day. Columbia's not telling you anything. The whole thing was so slipshod. Bruce Hudson's mom, the legendary Aunt Ruth, she finds out on her way to work from the radio the next morning. This is, 15 hours later, and she had to pull off to the side of the road. You found out your only son is dead on the radio. That can't be right. So you take back to this era where Monday Night Football is one of the few things that connects you.
The crew of the Wood Rush returned to the cutter immediately. Here's John Crowley.
We got the call, and about 2.5 hours later, we were underway. And so it was all kind of a fever pitch at that point, understanding that Laker had been lost, unsighted, and on the other end of the lake. And we got gale storm winds and seas out there. So, as soon as you get back to the ship, it's about battening things down and making sure there's nothing loose, and you're going to make it to the other side without losing stuff in the meantime. And so it's just a fever pitch, kind of get you ready. And then so that's when we first really learned about what had happened. And we knew, I think, that there were other resources responding, but, aviation, there wasn't, I don't think, anything to see for the most part. And the other surface vessels were smaller than us. And as the sea started to build and build, they got out underway, but really never were able to conduct a search because they had limitations or restrictions placed on them.
The Wood Rush would arrive on the scene the following evening.
We got underway, I think, just after midnight on the 11th, following that evening on the 10th report. So a couple hours later, underway, about 20 hours, arriving about 8 o'clock in the evening on what we assumed was on scene, which was not too specified at that time. I mean, there were some indicators from the Anderson that had reported when they thought they had last seen things of that nature. But as soon as we got underway, I mean, this whole trip, you got a northeaster out there, and a northeaster running down Lake Superior, particularly this last run down to the Duluth area. That's down the gut. And right at the end of the gut, where is it? It's at the lift bridge and where you sail out of. And so just going through under the bridge there, you had swell starting to build. And it's not been that hard, that long at that point that storm had built, but it had affected us.
As the Wood Rush sped eastward across Lake Superior, word of the Fitzgerald's loss spread. Here's Dennis Anderson.
That night, we informed one of our sister stations down in the Twin Cities what had happened. They were the only other media that we informed, and they weren't even aware of it around the region until the next day. And then we got bombarded with stations really all over the United States. And so we did a number of reports for them, both audio, and we did send some video to some stations. But it didn't take long before it got to a national story.
The Duluth Herald was the city's afternoon paper. On November 11th, the Herald's front page headline read, "Laker sinks, 29 lost."
The U.S. Coast Guard today reported the Edmund Fitzgerald, a Great Lakes bulk carrier, has sunk after disappearing from radar about 7:10 p.m. Monday with 29 persons aboard. Quote, "It has sunk. The ship disappeared off the radar scopes in the area, and we've searched 18 hours for the vessel. We classify it as sunk," said a spokesman at Coast Guard headquarters in Washington. The Coast Guard determined that the vessel sunk after making positive identification of a life raft from serial numbers found on it. No presumption of the crew's fate had been made as of noon Central Standard Time, said Chief Jay Bennett, officer of the day at U.S. Coast Guard Operations Center in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. Duluth Herald, November 11th, 1975.
Just about the time that newspaper was hitting Duluth doorsteps, the wood rush was arriving on the scene. Here's John Crowley.
Well, I think that you always want hope, whether that's a reasoned statement or not, I don't know, but you always want to feel that. And I think that what we knew and what the kind of the word that spread was that, about 10 years ago in a previous sinking, and one of the members of the crew did survive, and now different kind of circumstances, but so you think that you might find, survivors, might find the lifeboats, might find, so that's what you're hoping to be able to find. And the fact that nobody has seen them yet, trying to see a lifeboat, even from in the middle of a storm, even when you have a low-flying Coast Guard HU-16, which was up that night, and I think the Canadians had some C-130s as well. But I've been up, as a cadet, I also got sent to the aviation side to spend a couple weeks figuring out what they do and what their world's like, and it's hard to see. So with that in mind, I say that because then I go, just because somebody doesn't see anything and there's no reports right now, doesn't mean there's nothing down there. And so you go look now, and I think my memory is I had to watch when we first got on scene. And within about a half hour, we found a life ring that added some degree of hope. But that was the last thing we found.
When the Fitzgerald's badly damaged lifeboats were located, hopes of finding survivors dimmed further. Those two lifeboats are now on display at the Museum Ship Valley Camp in Sault Ste. Marie. Here's curator Paul Sabrin.
Lifeboat number 2 was washed ashore at Mamaines Point, which is north of Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. And lifeboat number 1 was spotted by the Arthur M. Anderson the next morning at 8 a.m. and was picked up by the Rice, which was one of the boat that was then surveying the area.
Responders' focus turned to finding the wreck itself. Here's Kaylee Matuzak of the Lake Superior Maritime Visitor Center.
Yeah, people, I think, because either if they've heard the song or they weren't there, when everything actually went down, they assume, maybe Titanic type, it's still missing. So a common question we do get is did they ever find it? It's pretty much the next day, actually, with the big magnet.
John Crowley on the Wood Rush assisted with the search. The wreck's location would ultimately be determined on Friday, November 14th by a U.S. Navy plane with a magnetic anomaly detector. But the Wood Rush had an early hint of where the wreck might be.
I think a lark, as much as anything, I turned on the fathometer just to see how deep we were and things like that. And we kept that running, and that has a trace capability. And when we went back and looked, we noticed as we kind of did our search pattern when we crossed this one area, we were getting a bit of a different blip. And I don't know that means anything particularly. Kind of filed it away. And as later flights by Navy capability that looked for magnetic anomalies, and that might be the vessel on the ground floor, and then the tow array that came in those first couple days in terms of the search, where it was the same spot where we marked from our own fathometer, which is a very crude instrument. This is now 50 years ago, almost today.
Once the wreck's general location was known, the Woodrush was enlisted to use side-scan sonar to learn more details. That involved lowering a transducer array into the water and towing it over the location where the wreck was believed to be.
Then we had the submersible arrive, and so we went into Sault Ste. Marie, collected that, probably a few of the technicians that go with that, set it up on board, put it out, did our, then set up a very precise pattern, just like we would on a search and rescue scale, but a precise pattern for the tow. And I remember looking at over the shoulder of the technicians, and they got a screen, and that looks like a black and white, TV that's not tuned in. It's a lot of dots and a lot of spikes on it. It not tell me a damn thing. And also they say, okay, I think we got something that passed. We're a little bit to the side. We got to come back over, and so they're trying to tell me more about where we had to sail so that we would get a good picture of what they were seeing, and then they could tell more about it. And so we, that was a repetitive process, and not just once, but another time they tuned things up again, and eventually they'd go, okay, this is what we're seeing. Here's it looks like the part of the ship, and in either not knowing what the situation is yet, but either the foreship or the stern of the ship with the deck house. This is one of those deck houses, and so they knew that much, but didn't know which one. You don't see signs, you don't see the deck equipment to understand the orientation or any of that yet.
So at that point, just days after the Fitzgerald sank, the Woodrush knew there were two large pieces of wreckage on the lake bottom. They lay about 17 miles north-northwest of Whitefish Point in Canadian waters.
And almost immediately, there's a sense of there will be a more formal investigation, Marine Board investigation, and so that meant that they were looking at, I don't remember the exact timeline of preparing, but they started looking at using a submersible to go down and be able to take pictures, get more detailed information. How would we support that was the question. So we had to construct our own mini Loran system with repeaters so we could go out and pinpoint where we needed to be. And then the idea was we'd establish a 3-point more over that point, so that we could control our orientation as the submersible went down. So there were a lot of planning. What kind of buoy anchor would we use to moor to the bottom? In that case, how deep of the line? What's the scope to put out? I mean, a lot of the work that a buoy tender really has a pretty good idea on. So I think we did a pretty good job from my lowly vantage point of preparing for the spring when the investigation was going to come back, and we were going to be the platform, and it was going to be a pretty unique opportunity to see how the next phase, ran out.
The Woodrush would return in spring 1976 to get a more detailed look at the wreck. It was clear, though, that the Edmund Fitzgerald had been lost. In the city where the Fitzgerald had been expected to unload its ore, the Detroit Free Press reported on community reactions.
In Washington, United States Representative Philip Ruppy, a Republican from Michigan, called for an inquiry into the loss of the ship, which at 13,600 tons is the second largest ship ever lost in Superior. 2 Coast Guard boats remained on Lake Superior Tuesday evening, and the air search was scheduled to continue Wednesday. While the fate of the crewmen remained in limbo, Tuesday, the bells of the Mariners Church, 170 East Jefferson, in Detroit, were rung 29 times by the church's pastor, the Reverend Richard W. Ingalls. At a noon ceremony, Ingalls also offered prayers for the lost men. The Fitzgerald had been scheduled to arrive in the Detroit River at 5 p.m. Tuesday. The Detroit mailboat, J.W. Westcott, had 5 bags of laundry, some freight, and a bag full of mail waiting here for the crew. Detroit Free Press, November 12th, 1975.
The Coast Guard's inquiry into the wreck officially began on November 18th. From mid-November through mid-December, the appointed Marine Board took testimony from dozens of people, including Bernie Cooper of the Anderson, who repeated his insistence that the Fitzgerald had gone over 6 Fathom Shoal. Divers looked at the shoal and found no evidence of recent damage to the rock, although it's possible they could have missed something, or that the ship hit but failed to leave a mark. When it became possible to view the wreck, there also was no clear evidence to support the hypothesis of a hull fracture taking place before the ship sank. That said, viewing the wreckage left a lot of open questions. In May 1976, the Woodrush returned to the wreck with a submersible that had a black and white television camera, allowing investigators to actually look at the wreckage identified the previous November. Here's John Crowley.
The fascinating part to me was sitting kind of in the wardroom with the TV screen after the submersible went down, and we're starting to see the damage. And the first thing you see is the name board. So okay, this is the Fitzgerald. And then the next thing they go around to focus on is the part of the vessel where they had separated and looked at basically torn metal. And so the naval engineers that were aboard, they looked like, I have this image of being kids in a candy shop, because they got, okay, what's the size and the kind of steel at that part of the ship? And they pulled out that information. They, were estimating the size at the rips and the jagged versus straight. And they're going, man, that thing must have hit the bottom at some tremendous speed. And so, it's just, then that kind of lit up the room. How did that happen?
That officially confirmed the wreck was the Edmund Fitzgerald, lying on the lake bed in 2 large pieces as well as countless smaller bits. The bow or front section sat right side up, while the stern or rear was upside down. The official investigation would ultimately conclude that the Fitzgerald split up when it dove to the bottom at high speed, its propeller still spinning. Here's author Frederick Stonehouse.
And that's the way transportation would set it up, with the torquing action of hitting the bottom, possibly breaking off the stern or separating the vessel into 3 pieces, all of them relatively close to one another. So did they crack on the surface, as Cousteau believed? Maybe. Did they crack on the bottom, structurally hitting, as Cooper, as transportation safety believed? Maybe. I don't know it makes any real difference at this point in time.
Beyond the Breakers co-host Tanner Johnson, who has studied a lot of shipwrecks, also thinks it's most likely the Fitzgerald split upon impact with the bottom.
Did she break up on the surface? Did she break up after she had already started to go under? And I think also in terms of like the ship, the possibility of breaking in half on the surface, that is something that the more that we've covered stories like that is the idea that, rather than when that happens to a ship, rather than both sides going down really quickly, they stay afloat for a long time. And so, when that happens, you often do have a chance to send out an SOS. You do have a chance to communicate because, it's not just going to drop like a stone. And so I think that is, one of the things that sort of maybe took that somewhat off the table, is you'd think that would have given an opportunity to just send out a call.
The official Marine Casualty Report would not be released until 1977. Most of the report was simply a detailed accounting of what was known about the Edmund Fitzgerald, the storm, and the wreck. The report proved controversial, though, because of its conclusion.
The most probable cause of the sinking of the SS Edmund Fitzgerald was the loss of buoyancy and stability resulting from massive flooding of the cargo hold. The flooding of the cargo hold took place through ineffective hatch closures as boarding seas rolled along the spar deck. U.S. Coast Guard Marine Casualty Report, July 26, 1977.
Those 3 words: ineffective hatch closures. Here's Kaylee Matuzak.
I'm of the mind that the hatch cover theory was the Coast Guard's way of kind of putting the blame on people that are no longer alive to dispute it, as opposed to a company that might be able to do some stuff with some money. That's my mind.
Again, Tanner Johnson.
If the narrative is, unsecured hatch covers, led to this ultimately massive flooding of the hold. Well, it's like that story, that puts a lot on the crew and saying, is this Captain McSorley not ordering this to happen? Is this the crew members themselves not doing it properly? Is this complacency is a word you hear a lot of that possibility. If this is how if this is how the ship has operated for years, you never think today is going to be the day. It becomes a problem. And so like that element of the story puts a lot on the crew. And, obviously, if you are, family and friends of the crew, that's not the explanation you want to hear.
John Crowley said debates over the cause of the Edmund Fitzgerald's loss started during the search itself, and that the two basic narratives, it was shoaling versus hatch covers, had emerged early on. Each of the Edmund Fitzgerald's 21 cargo hatch covers had 68 manually positioned clamps. That makes a total of 1,428 clamps.
That's a lot of clamps to go make sure are tied down, are cinched down, as you come through underneath the lift bridge, and you're going around, make sure that's done, and you're already starting to feel the seas. So, that skepticism as to whether the hatches are going to be tied down tight, and then there's a report on the vents haven't been torn away, and I don't know that lets in one hell of a lot of water, but it's something. So you get two camps and two feelings out there. And as I kind of understood it, it was other captains that were reporting hated to report sounding like McSorley didn't do his job because he was admired. Now, whether they were really being honest with what they reported or whether they were soft selling what they felt, nobody knows except them. And I'm not going to enter into that debate.
Frederick Stonehouse is inclined to listen carefully to Captain Cooper's views on shoaling, but he points out that there is simply no definitive evidence. Stonehouse references the Michipicoten, a Canadian freighter built in 1952 that, in 2024, suddenly developed a 13-foot crack in its hull, likely due to structural fatigue. Stonehouse also mentions the Arthur B. Homer, built in 1960 and considered a sister ship to the Edmund Fitzgerald. The Homer was lengthened in fall 1975, the very season the Edmund Fitzgerald was lost, but quietly laid up just 5 years later. When the Arthur B. Homer was scrapped in 1987, it was interpreted as a casualty of that decade's collapse in world steel production. But speculation has long swirled that the ship's operators feared that if structural failures contributed to the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, the very similar Arthur B. Homer could also be vulnerable. Here's Frederick Stonehouse.
Cooper was the only witness to the problem. He's the nearest single witness, the fellow that was on site and on scene. If he believes it was shoaling, you've got to put a lot of credit within that. But you also had Dick Race and Neptune Marine go out there immediately after the wreck to survey the shoal and found no evidence of being structurally hit by any vessel. I think you've got to put that in the mix of what you're doing. You've got the idea that she cracked in two, brittle steel fracture. Was it a fracture of the hull getting back to Michipicoten? Why did the sister ship Arthur B. Homer be taken out of service very rapidly after the Fitzgerald sank? Is there a connection between the two? The sister ship, does she have the same design problem Fitzgerald had? If that indeed is true, if there's any evidence supporting it, because again, when you roll back and you say, where's the data? There is lots of thought and lots of people hold their hand up, but nobody's sitting there with the gold key that explains what happened.
The Lake Carriers Association, which represented Great Lakes shipping companies, responded to the Coast Guard report with a strongly worded letter in September 1977. Here are excerpts from that letter.
The lake shipping industry, proud of its safety record through the years, completely rejects the Coast Guard theoretical cause of the Fitzgerald sinking. We call attention to almost 40 years' experience with the current type of hatch covers and closure clamps that have been improved during the period. If ineffective closings exist, as alleged by the Coast Guard, surely, during the 40 years operating experience, there would have been watery cargo to unload, be it ore, grain, or stone. This not only would have been readily apparent, but also a costly problem that vessel and cargo owners would not tolerate. Regarding the Fitzgerald, it is also questionable whether water in the cargo hold would have resulted in a list, since it would not have been restricted to one side of the vessel. Letter from Lake Carriers Association to the National Transportation Safety Board, September 16th, 1977.
The Lake Carriers Association argued that the water being pumped, McSorley said his pumps were working, was coming from the ballast tanks, not the cargo hold. How did the water get into the ballast tanks? Most likely from shoaling, the Lake Carriers Association argued, but definitely not through the hatches. There were several later dives on the wreck, and yet even being able to survey the wreck in detail didn't answer many questions about exactly what happened on the night of November 10th, 1975. Frederick Stonehouse wrote one of the first books on the disaster, and he's been closely following everything that has happened since. The most recent edition of his book, The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, has just been published. Even after all these years, though, even after all the scholarship and science and speculation that's gone on, he says we haven't really learned all that much.
We don't know anything more about what the Fitzgerald sunk today than we do when it sunk. A little bit more. We know who was on it. We have better crew roles. We certainly have an opportunity to determine the depth and the physical structure of the wreck with limited one dive, essentially for survey purposes officially, and then a couple of dives that were more showman dives than they were anything else. Done for the best of reasons, but they weren't dives that determined the engineering structure of the vessel or the cause of loss, particularly. So 50 years later, we don't know anything more. At the point that the last dive went down in August, I think it was, of 1989, which was the last survey dive done on the wreck. I was there for that too, very interesting, but that was the last hard information that came off that wreck. And everything else was pick them up along the way. In other words, we managed to sneak a publicity dive in for Joe McGinnis, for example, doing his survey. He recovered the bell. It was certainly a very goodwill gesture, but didn't add anything to the knowledge of the wreck. So in my view, there's nothing that we have any different now than we had when she went down.
Today, diving to the wreck site is forbidden by the Canadian government. In the final episode of this podcast, we'll hear from a man who dove to the wreck before the prohibition took effect, becoming one of the very few people to ever see and touch the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald.
We were looking at our gas. It took us a bit longer than we thought to descend. I bet it took us close to almost 10 minutes to descend the full length. But I remember I said, all right, well, let's turn around and let's go up to the main deck level and then the wheelhouse, which is right there. And, just to see the name on it. And I tend to be a very kinesthetic person. And so one of the things that it was kind of a relief. It's like, okay, a lot has gone into this. We're here.
Edmund Fitzgerald, 50 Years Below, is a production of the Duluth News Tribune. This podcast is written and narrated by Jay Gabler, with audio engineering by Wyatt Buckner and Dan Williamson. The audio of this episode was edited by Wyatt Buckner. Our editors on this project are Katie Rohman and Barrett Chase, and our executive editor is Rick Lubbers. Original score composed by William Bruegemann. Newspaper archive excerpts and other historical documents were read by Teri Cadeau, Barrett Chase, and Dan Williamson. Thanks to our guests on this episode: Dennis Anderson, John U. Bacon, John Crowley, Tanner Johnson, Kaylee Matuzak, Paul Sabrin, Frederick Stonehouse, and Terrence Teisall. Thanks also to Maria Lockwood of the Superior Telegram for participating in our interview of Dennis Anderson. Read more stories about the Edmund Fitzgerald and learn more about this podcast at DuluthNewsTribune.com.